Good evening, everyone. Thank you. So today we're going to go on a virtual journey from yesterday's grey and grizzly and grey Glasgow to the beautiful sunny Barcelona. So we'll be looking at Gaudi. And as you by now are familiar with, I'm going to give you a little bit of a socio-political and cultural context of Barcelona around 1900, and then we're going to jump into some of the key buildings that Gaudi built in the 1890s and in the early 20th century. Okay, so around 1900, Barcelona featured approximately 500,000 inhabitants and was Spain's leading industrial city. And that has come about because from the 1850s roughly onwards, Barcelona had undergone a lot of building projects, not quite as organized as in Brussels, for example, or in Paris with the Haussmannization, but the city limits have steadily increased because more and more neighboring community were incorporated into the city. Now, most of the money that was made between most of the 19th century until 1898 came from colonial holdings in the Philippines and in Cuba. But when the so-called colonial crisis of 1898 hit, which I'm sure many of you might be familiar with, Spain as a whole really suffered economically. But Barcelona's industrialists and merchants and bankers essentially closed ranks and reorganized themselves in such a way that they tried to, or made really concerted efforts to protect the domestic markets. They repatriated capital, and they spent a lot of energy in regenerating communal politics. So as the rest of Spain entered a period of serious economic stagnation and pessimism, Barcelona's city fathers carried out a series of social reforms and modernized the city's infrastructure. So while everything was going downhill in most of Spain, in Barcelona things were looking actually really good. There was a lot of growth, and the population, the upper classes especially, were quite optimistic. And the city fathers were really committed in the late 1890s to transform Barcelona into a great metropolitan city. And they wanted, or they had aspirations to turn Barcelona into the Paris of the South. So there's a lot of architecture that falls under the umbrella of international Art Nouveau. There's a lot of architecture that's of interest for us in this session in Barcelona, and there's virtually none in Madrid. One of your lovely fellow students yesterday said that she was in Madrid and she was looking for Art Nouveau architecture, and she found one building. So these new municipal programs that I was just mentioning were very much like the ones I talked about yesterday in Glasgow. They incorporated programs for education, for health, and in general for cultural and social reform. And this, of course, as many of you know, was tied to a rise of Catalonian nationalism. So these years in the 1890s, late 1890s, and until the First World War really marked an extraordinary move away from the kind of central Spanish administration and allocated a lot of power to the city government. So in short, Barcelona around 1900 was thriving. And as we know, when a city does well, when its population, its merchants, its bankers, its industrialists do well, architecture does well. It impacts the built environment of a city. So this is why we have this incredible blossoming of artistic creativity. And again, just like in many of the other cities that we've looked at so far, it is the progressive Catalan upper middle class that supports a whole new generation of architects who were, so the middle class who support those architects were also politically committed to this new wave of Catalan nationalism. And just as in Brussels and in Glasgow, these architects experimented with new building techniques, new building technologies, and especially in Barcelona and especially with Gaudi, they embraced exuberant decoration to produce a building style that spoke to this new generation of urban dwellers. And what emerges during these years, during the late 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century, is so-called modernista architecture. Now, this is the kind of milieu from which Antoni Gaudi emerged. I'm showing you here this wonderful photograph of a quite intense young man looking right at us or through us. And next to the portrait of him, I show you his studio, which was an amazing space. And some of you might recognize a model of the Sagrada Familia in the studio. And we'll look at this complex, vexing, over-the-top structure at the very end of our lecture. Gaudi is often considered as the embodiment, of course, of Barcelona's modernista architecture, and that is a local manifestation of international Art Nouveau. But Gaudi would not have liked to be called a follower of modernista, because he rejected the kind of cosmopolitan values that it represented. Gaudi was extremely religious, he was very Catholic, and he was a member of a group of artists who called themselves the Circle of St. Luke. And this group had the intention of setting an example of moral rectitude that was in line with official Catholic doctrine. So Gaudi was keen to develop a design language that offered an alternative to the kind of agnosticism and the perceived hedonism of modernity. So when someone labels him modernista, you can see how there's a tension there. Gaudi wanted to find this kind of morally righteous architectural language, and of course he looks back at Western traditions of function and structure that were anchored in Romanesque and Gothic architecture. Because for Gaudi, the Gothic was really the most advanced and autonomous style. And I'm just showing you here